Let's start with a definition of the sentence, and then we'll look at each part in depth. A sentence is an 8-measure structure comprising of two phrases, the presentation phrase and the continuation phrase. The presentation phrase begins with a 2-measure basic idea that prolongs tonic harmony. The basic idea is then repeated either with the same harmony or a dominant harmony or a sequential harmony, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Think of a presentation phrase as trying to create stability by establishing a tonic harmony, a characteristic melody, and a texture for the piece. The continuation phrase, on the other hand, attempts to destabilize what the presentation phrase has done through 4 processes. Fragmentation, which is a technique of taking apart and using small chunks of the basic idea. Harmonic acceleration, which is a decrease in the time that a single harmony is used. Increase in surface rhythmic activity, for example, shorter durations of notes or more notes. And then sequential harmonic progressions. Now, not all of these processes will be used on every theme, but at least one of them will be. Finally, the continuation phrase ends with a cadence of some sort. It's also common to see a technique called liquidation, in which the momentum from the continuation phrase is reduced, and there's a systematic reduction in the melodic motivic material. Unfortunately, due to the amount of variety you have in the continuation phrase, you can't easily break it into small chunks like a basic idea or a repetition of the basic idea. But I think you'll find the techniques themselves are not that complicated and really come alive when you start to hear the music. So by far the most commonly used example of a sentence is the opening theme to Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 1. So let's listen to it, and then we'll go into depth on each one of these parts of the sentence. This theme is such a great example because Beethoven writes so clearly. The first 2 bars are the basic idea in which Beethoven clearly sets out the trajectory of the piece. This specific figure of a rising tonic triad is called the Mannheim Rocket. Mozart was very fond of using the Mannheim Rocket because not only could you clearly establish tonic, but you also have a characteristic opening up of the melody. You can also see 2 distinct motives in the basic idea and only one harmony. The harmony is F minor, which in this case is tonic, and the 2 motives are the rising arpeggiated chord in the first bar, the Mannheim Rocket, and the short stepwise melodic turn in the second bar. Underneath, Beethoven keeps the accompaniment relatively simple, just a few tonic chords in root position. Now in the next 2 bars, the basic idea is repeated. Notice how it is repeated, though. Beethoven changes to a dominant 7th chord in first inversion. Remember, first inversion for 7th chords is annotated with a 6 and 5. Now, in terms of shape, the melody looks the same. You have the rising chord, you have the stepwise melodic turn, but the notes are different. They fit with a new dominant harmony. Now, obviously, he repeats the melody, but this is a special kind of repetition called statement-response repetition. So the presentation phrase has the basic idea in tonic, and then it is repeated in dominant. Let's hear it one more time. Next we have the continuation phrase. Let's go ahead and listen to that separately. Now notice how the first bar of the continuation phrase is almost exactly the same as the second bar of the basic idea. The only difference is a grace note leading up to the A flat. Now let's just take a minute to understand the harmony. Think back to the section on prolongation progressions. And remember how I said prolongation progressions prolong tonic harmony. Well, if you look at the basic idea, there is clearly tonic throughout. The repetition moves to dominant, so you might think that we're done prolonging tonic at that point. But if you look again at the first chord in the continuation phrase, it's tonic. It just won't go away. Beethoven prolonged the tonic all the way to the continuation phrase. In fact, look at the next bar, because he does it again. He moves to another dominant version of the motive, but this time it's just like bar 4, with an added grace note and a different inversion, second inversion, which is written as a V43 or 543. Notice, though, in the continuation, instead of 2 bars of tonic and 2 bars of dominant, we have 1 bar of each. This is an example of increasing the harmonic rhythm. This is one of those 4 processes that I talked about. You can even make the case that the surface rhythm has been increased with the added grace note and no rest bar for the left hand, like in the basic idea. So you just have more notes in a shorter amount of space. Let's listen to it. Now, obviously, I mentioned that there's an increase in the harmonic rhythm, but also key to this is there's fragmentation. Each idea in the continuation phrase is now 1 bar instead of 2 bars, like in the presentation phrase. And he cut them directly out of the basic idea, although that's not always necessary for fragmentation. Fragmentation is really just shortening the bars, or shortening the amount of time an idea is used. So even the dynamic sforzando, written as an SF, shows the increase in energy. Beethoven wants you to play that part with a sudden, forceful accent. Now this finally leads into the cadential idea. Let's listen to it. Now the first chord of the last 2 bars is the climax of the theme. You can really feel the energy has built to this moment. For one, it's the highest note in the entire theme, a C6. Now a quick note on octaves. I recommend that you get to learn the standard American Acoustical Society designation of octaves. And there are several different methods for labeling octaves. MIDI uses one way, some theory books use another. I prefer to use this Acoustical Society's method of labeling middle C as C4. Now the main reason is because it's the most common, and if anyone questions you on it, you can say, hey, well, are you going to go against the Acoustical Society of America? They probably won't have a good comeback to that, and then you can just continue a fruitful conversation, not having to argue about which octave designation you're going to use. But as a practical matter, knowing the octave numbers will really be handy in learning instrument ranges when you move on to orchestration. You need to know if the range of a violin is from low G up to, whatever high E, you need to know what G that is. Is that G3 or is it G4? Those are the kind of things that become very important for you being able to compose quickly for specific instruments. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get back to the theme. Now, as I was saying, the beginning of the cadential idea is the highest note in the theme. Beethoven has built up tension throughout the entire theme. The dynamic is also fortissimo, or double F. Now it's time to release that tension, and he does this through the process of liquidation, which is stripping away the theme's characteristic melodic elements. In this case, it's just a simple descending scale line, but there's also a rapid decrease in the dynamic from fortissimo down to piano. But Beethoven still wants to connect it with the original idea, so he puts that turn in the second bar, but now it's upside down. And then finally, he ends on a 5 chord, or with a root position triad, and this is known as a half cadence. Let's listen one more time to the complete theme, and I really want you to try and hear the form. If you have to, close your eyes, don't look at the music, just try to hear how each section is split up, how they all work together. It's about how these elements and processes all work together to create the feeling of structure, a feeling of beginning, middle, and end. Now that we've looked at an entire sentence, let's learn how to create our own. Now, we talked about the definition of a basic idea in the previous lesson, but let's get into detail about what that means. The basic idea accomplishes a lot for us as composers, so we need to make sure we understand everything it's doing. The two-measure basic idea has a few different goals. First, it's the first piece of music that really sets the trajectory for the rest of the piece. You'll see in Music Composition 201, there are times when you have music prior to the basic idea called the introduction, but in terms of impact, the basic idea is where you get the most bang for your buck. It also establishes the characteristic material for your piece. Characteristic material is the kind of music that you'll remember. It's what makes your piece different. Think of Mozart's Rondo alla Turca. The Rondo alla Turca is one of those pieces that's just instantly recognizable. Mozart starts it with that very characteristic feel, it just sticks out when you hear it. Now, this is differentiated from conventional material, which if you just plop it down could be from any old piece. Now, these are things like scales, arpeggios, and just general passage work. Now, in the original example, we saw a 2-bar basic idea. But it's important to understand the technical definition is actually 2 real measures. The distinction seems small, but sometimes there's a difference between a real measure and a notated measure. Most of the time, real and notated measures coincide. In the case of Beethoven's opening theme, they do, but occasionally a composer will compress the entire theme into 4 bars or expand it into 16 bars. But if you were just listening to the music, not looking at the notation, you'd probably just hear it as actually 8 bars. That's because the written measures may be a compression by 1/2 or a doubling of the actual real measures. We'll get more into this phenomenon later in the course when we look at rhythm in depth. For now, just realize if you are looking at some music and the entire sentence seems to fit within 4 bars or go for 16 bars, just sing it to yourself, maybe try to conduct it, and realize the real measure may be more like 1/2 bar or 2 bars of the written notation. Sometimes writing your basic idea can be the hardest part of composing. It's the classic blank page problem. The possibilities seem endless, so you just buckle under the pressure and crawl under your desk, rocking back and forth, saying, "Basic idea, I need a basic idea." Well, snap out of it. I have a plan. There's that word again, limitations. You see, in order to reduce the mental torment that you're putting on yourself, we're going to reduce the amount of options we have. As usual, for demonstration purposes, we'll be using our old trusty friend C major. Oh, C major, how I love thee. So simple, so sweet. Now, our first limitation is tonic prolongation. We know the basic idea is there to establish a tonic harmony for your piece, so at least the opening basic idea should be in tonic. For now, we're going to use just one harmony throughout the basic idea, but later I'll show you some of the most common harmonic patterns that you can be using for your basic ideas. Our second limitation is a chord tone melody, like you learned to compose in Melody and Harmony Part 1. Already it's seeming simpler. Now that means as far as strong beats go, we have only 3 notes to choose from, in this case C, E, and G. Our third limitation is melodic opening up. Now the concept of melodic opening up generally means that the melodic idea rises instead of falls. You have to remember this is a general concept. The execution is always a little bit more nuanced. In the case of Beethoven's basic idea, there's a clear opening up with that Mannheim rocket, but it also goes down just a little bit in the second bar. It's important to have a little bit of variety in your melody, so just one direction is not usually that good, but going up and up a little bit or down a little bit is what we're really looking for. For us right now, though, it should be relatively simple. We're just starting with chord tones, so moving upward with chord tones, and then you can move downward just a little bit. Now, our fourth limitation is at least 2 different motives. So we've barely talked about motives so far. Many people look at motives as the building blocks of music, but that's not actually true, not at least in classical form. Motives are like the raw material that go into those building blocks. It's like if you build a house, you need pieces of wood and you also need nails. They're both required. Well, you couldn't really build a house out of just nails. I mean, I suppose you could melt them together or something and form something, but it's not very practical. Well, that's kind of like the relationship of motives. A motive may be a nail, and it may be a piece of wood, maybe some glue in there. You mix it all together, and that's what creates the house. It's much easier to create longer themes and movements when you're starting with larger elements. So the motives are part of the basic idea, but you're not thinking necessarily on the motivic level, not at least at this part of your composition. You're thinking on the larger idea level. So what defines a motive is basically up to you. It could be as complex as a line like Beethoven's with a descending scale melody and a turn. This motive turns up all over the place in the first movement of his piano sonata. A motive could also be as simple as one note. Many times it's the relationship both harmonically and rhythmically that defines a motive. You may have something like this. That's from Beethoven, and that's obviously a relatively complex motive. But you could have something really simple, something like this. Either one works. For now, our motives will be relatively simple because we're sticking to just the chord tone melodies. But as we progress through the course, I'll show you ways of creating interesting rhythmic ideas and melodic ideas that are unique and sound great. So why at least two motives? Well, this is one of the true powers of the basic idea. The basic idea is sized just right to be small enough to combine with other ideas like repetitions and continuations, but it's just large enough to be broken down into smaller chunks. This is that fragmentation process that I talked about earlier in the continuation phrase. The basic idea is a way of creating unity among different elements of your music. You're no longer using random lengths of phrases or randomly throwing in motives as you see fit. You're using logic. This is what I meant when I talked about the trivium earlier on in the course. We learn the grammar first, and then we use that grammar in a logical way. This knowing a basic idea is made up of multiple motives and can be fit with other ideas and continued on. Well, that's logic. That's all logical. So once again, your limitations are tonic prolongation, a chord tone melody with the chord tones connected, melodic opening up, and at least two motives. Now I have a video that you can watch of exercise 1. I show you how to go through creating multiple basic ideas, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to just compose a bunch of basic ideas. I want to get you familiar with and comfortable with the process of creating a lot of ideas quickly. That way you're not mentally filtering them out before you write them down. Sometimes as you're composing, you'll say, oh, maybe that's not such a good idea, and you won't write it down. I highly recommend against that. The reason is because maybe the next day you come to it, you say, you know what, that actually is a good idea. Maybe you just need to tweak one note here or tweak a little phrase there or something. But you never know where your greatest ideas are going to come from, so you need to get in the habit of just writing them all down.